opened his cabin door not to let them in, but to force himself to let them go. The cold air rushed in as the massive horse stood frozen at the threshold, her two foals pressed close behind her. He didn't move, didn't speak. His hand trembled against the doorframe, as if the wood could hold him back. Something had changed overnight, something that meant this shelter was never meant to last. The hinges gave a tired groan as the cabin door eased inward, and the dawn cold slipped across the floorboards like water finding a crack. Caleb Hart did not step back right away. He stood in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame, shoulders rigid beneath an old flannel coat, staring at the mare as if the shape of her might still change if he held himself still enough. She waited a few feet from the porch, black as wet stone in the half-light, large enough to seem carved out of the dim morning itself. The two foals stood close against her sides. One tucked its nose beneath her chest and peered out with uncertain eyes. The other kept shifting its weight, lifting and lowering one small hoof against the hard-packed ground, sensing the strain in the silence even if it could not understand it. Inside the cabin the fire had burned low. A red seam of heat glowed beneath the ash in the iron stove, throwing just enough warmth to keep the room from turning mean. On the table near the window lay a folded letter, already addressed, already stamped. Beside it sat a woman's gray scarf, frayed at one end where years ago a ring had snagged the thread and pulled it loose. Caleb had kept that scarf draped over a chair all winter, then moved it to the table last night, as though setting it beside the letter made both things less lonely. He looked back once, only once, at the letter. Then his eyes returned to the mare. For weeks she had filled the cabin with life, her breath steaming near the stove, her heavy steps careful on the planks, her watchfulness turning the small room into something shared instead of abandoned. The foals had changed it even more. They had bumped into chairs, nosed old tin pails, curled themselves near the hearth with the reckless trust of the young. Their presence had rearranged the air. The place no longer sounded like a man waiting out his last years. It sounded like something unfinished. And that was the danger. Caleb swallowed hard. The morning tasted of wood smoke, thawing mud, and the faint sweetness of hay. Outside, winter had begun to loosen its grip. The snow was no longer a clean white sheet, but a patchwork of gray slush and exposed earth. Water ticked steadily from the roof. Somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen birds had started up again, thin, hopeful calls threading through the chill. Spring was working its way in, whether he was ready or not. The mare turned her head toward the eastern trail. That small movement, nothing more than an angle of the neck, went through him like a blade. He had seen it for days now. The way she watched the old trail beyond the cottonwoods. The way she quieted whenever the wind came from that direction. The way she gathered the foals closer at dusk, not in fear, but in readiness. She was not restless in the manner of something trapped. She was patient in the manner of something waiting for another creature to catch up. Catch up, Caleb thought bitterly. With what? With a promise he had delayed too long. His gaze drifted to the line of hills beyond the yard, their edges softened by morning mist. Past them, beyond the thawing creek and the split-rail fences and the low valley road, lay another ranch, another life. A son who had left angry and stayed gone long enough for silence to harden into habit. Caleb rubbed his thumb along the rough grain of the doorframe. Last night, when the lantern burned low and the mare refused to lie down, he had finally understood what had been pressing at him all season. She had not come into his cabin to belong to him. She had come carrying movement in her bones, a direction, an end he had mistaken for a beginning. The boulder foal took 2 uncertain steps towards the porch. Caleb's chest tightened so sharply he almost reached for it. Almost. Instead, he lowered his hand and let it hang at his side. The foal stopped on its own and flicked its ears back toward its mother. The mare did not call it. She simply stood, dark and steady, her eyes fixed on Caleb with that unbearable calm he had come to know too well. Not accusation, not pleading, recognition. "You knew," he said, and his voice came out scraped thin from a sleepless night. "Didn't you?" The mare breathed out, steam curling around her muzzle. Behind him, the letter waited on the table like a witness. He had written it slowly, stopping every few lines, starting again when the words felt too stiff or too late. He had not asked forgiveness in it. He had finally become old enough to know some things sounded smaller when begged for. He had written the truth instead. About the winter. About the emptiness of the cabin before the mare arrived. About the way a man can mistake pride for endurance until he has almost no life left around him. A drop of water fell from the porch roof and darkened the wood between his boots, then another. The second foal pressed closer to the mare's flank, and Caleb saw, with a dull ache, how both of them leaned into her without fear that she would vanish. He could not remember the last time anyone had leaned into him that way. He drew in a long breath and stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight. The cold came up through the soles of his boots. Slowly, as though any sudden motion might undo his nerve, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a length of worn leather strap. Not a lead rope, not a tether. Just something to lay across his palm while he decided whether his hands were strong enough for kindness. The mare took one step toward him. Not toward the cabin. Toward him. Caleb looked down at the strap, then past her again to the eastern trail, where the mud had begun to show through the snow in a narrow, dark line. By sundown, he knew, that line would be passable, and once it was, he would have no excuse left at all. The wind had been mean that night, sharp enough to slip through the seams of the cabin and bite at the edges of the room. Caleb had sat by the stove with his boots still on, listening to the walls creak and settle, counting the seconds between gusts the way a man counts time when there's nothing else left to measure it by. He hadn't expected company. Not out here, not anymore. The sound came low at first, something dull against the outer wall. He ignored it. Old habits told him everything out there could be weather pretending to be something else. Then it came again, heavier this time, closer to the door. Not a knock, more like a weight leaning in, testing the boundary. Caleb frowned and lifted his head. The third time, it wasn't a question anymore. He pushed himself up from the chair, joints stiff from the cold, and crossed the room. The lantern light flickered as he passed, throwing his shadow long across the boards. His hand hovered over the latch for a second longer than it should have. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Permission, maybe. Or the certainty that opening the door wouldn't change something he'd spent years keeping still. The latch lifted with a soft click. The wind forced its way in the moment the door cracked open, carrying a blast of snow and ice that stung his face. He leaned into it, pushing the door wider, and that's when he saw her. She stood so close to the threshold that for a moment he thought she might step inside on her own. A black mare, broad through the chest, her coat dusted white along the ridge of her back where the snow had settled and frozen. Steam rose from her flanks in steady waves, her breath heavy in the cold air. The two foals were nearly lost against her at first glance. Small shapes pressed tight, their legs unsteady beneath them. One tried to lift its head but faltered, nudging blindly against its mother's side. The other stared straight at Caleb, eyes wide, as if measuring him with a seriousness that didn't belong to something so young. He didn't move. For a long moment, none of them did. Snow blew past the doorway and scattered across the floorboards behind him. The fire hissed as flakes melted on the iron stove. Caleb felt the cold pushing into his back, but it was the silence between him and the mare that held him there. He had seen horses all his life, knew their moods, their tempers, the way fear showed in the whites of their eyes or the set of their ears. But this mare stood without panic, without aggression. There was something steadier in her, something that didn't beg and didn't demand. It simply waited. "You lost?" Caleb muttered, though the words sounded thin the moment they left him. The mare blinked slowly. The foals shifted closer. He looked past them into the storm, but there was nothing there. No fence line, no rider, no sign of where they had come from. Just wind and white and distance. His hand tightened on the edge of the door. For years, that threshold had meant something simple. What was his stayed inside. What wasn't stayed out. It had kept the world manageable, predictable. Empty, maybe, but quiet enough to bear. Now that line didn't feel so clear. The smaller foal stumbled forward half a step, its hoof slipping on the packed snow. It made a soft sound, more breath than voice, and leaned hard into the mare to steady itself. Caleb exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening without his permission. "All right," he said, barely louder than the wind. "That's enough of that." He stepped back. It wasn't a grand decision. No moment of clarity. Just a shift of weight, a widening of space. The mare moved first, careful as if she understood the rules had changed. Her hooves crossed the threshold one at a time, deliberate, testing the wood beneath her. The foals followed, clumsy and unsure, their bodies brushing against the doorframe as they came in. The cabin changed the instant they were inside. The air thickened with the smell of wet hide and cold earth. The quiet that had filled the room for years broke apart, replaced by the uneven rhythm of breathing, the soft scrape of hooves, the faint rustle of movement that refused to settle into silence. Caleb shut the door against the storm and stood there with his hand still on the wood, listening. One of the foals wandered toward the stove, drawn by the heat, and lowered its head cautiously, as if it expected the warmth to vanish if it got too close. The other stayed pressed to the mare, watching Caleb with that same unblinking focus. He dragged a chair back with his foot and grabbed the old wool blanket draped over it. Without thinking too much about it, he stepped toward the mare and lifted the blanket across her back. She didn't flinch, didn't step away, just stood and accepted it as if this, too, had been part of the plan. "You'll ruin my floor," he said, though there was no heat in it. The mare exhaled softly. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and turned toward the stove, tossing in another piece of wood. The fire caught quickly, flames licking up through the grate. The light shifted, warming the corners of the room, softening the hard lines of everything it touched. Behind him, the foals settled awkwardly onto the floorboards, their legs folding in ways that looked too fragile to trust. One let out a small, satisfied sigh as it found the heat. Caleb stood there, staring at the fire. For the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel like it was closing in on him. It felt full. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, rough with stubble, and glanced back over his shoulder. The mare's eyes met his again, steady and unreadable. "Just for the night," he said, as if he needed to hear the limit spoken out loud. "Storm will pass. Then you go." The words hung in the air, thin and uncertain. The mare didn't react. But the way she settled her weight, the way the foals curled closer to the stove without hesitation, made something in Caleb's chest tighten with a feeling he didn't want to name. He turned back to the fire and sat down slowly in his chair. Outside, the storm went on howling. Inside, something quieter had already begun to change. By the third morning, the cabin no longer sounded like a place built for one man. Caleb woke to movement instead of silence, the soft shuffle of hooves, the uneven rhythm of something alive adjusting to a space that had once been still. He sat up slowly in his chair, his back stiff, his eyes taking a moment to remember where he was. Then he saw them. One of the foals had worked its way closer to the stove, Its small body stretched awkwardly along the boards, legs tucked in a way that seemed too fragile to trust. The other stood near the door, ears flicking at every faint sound from outside, as if the world beyond the walls still held some claim on it. The mare stood between them, not guarding, not restless, just aware. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands and let out a slow breath. For a moment he forgot what the cabin had felt like before they came. Forgot the long stretches of nothing, the kind of quiet that pressed in until even your own breathing sounded like noise. Now there was a different kind of silence, one that moved, shifted, waited. He pushed himself up and crossed to the stove, adding wood with practiced motions. The flames rose again, throwing a low, steady warmth across the room. One of the foals lifted its head at the sound, blinking sleep from its eyes, then lowered it again with a soft exhale that almost sounded like contentment. "Don't get used to it," Caleb muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure who he was warning. He found an old tin bucket, filled it with water from the barrel, and set it near the wall. The bolder foal approached first this time, nudging the rim clumsily before figuring out how to drink. The other watched, hesitant, before taking a cautious step forward. The mare didn't move. She never rushed them, never pushed. Caleb noticed that more each day. He leaned against the table, arms folded loosely, and watched them without thinking too hard about why he stayed there longer than he needed to. There was something about the way they filled the space, unaware of the emptiness they had replaced, that made it easier not to look at the corners of the room where memory liked to sit. The chair by the window, the shelf that still held a cracked teacup he hadn't thrown away, the space where a voice used to be. He turned away from it all and reached for the kettle instead. Outside, the wind had softened. The storm that had driven them here was breaking apart, leaving behind a sky that felt wider, colder in a different way. By midday, the snow along the edges of the yard had begun to sag, its hard surface turning to slush under a pale sun. Caleb stepped out onto the porch with a mug in his hand. The air hit him clean and sharp. He stood there a while, scanning the land out of habit. The fence line, the ridge, the trail cutting through the cottonwoods to the east. That trail. He hadn't looked at it in years. Not really. The snow had covered most of it through the winter, smoothing it into the rest of the ground. But now, with the thaw setting in, a thin, dark line had begun to show again, mud pushing through. A path remembering itself. Caleb's jaw tightened. He turned his head, meaning to look away, but his eyes didn't quite follow through. They stayed on that line longer than they should have. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly. He didn't need to turn to know what it was. The mare stepped out onto the porch with the same quiet certainty she carried everywhere. The boards shifted under her weight, but she didn't hesitate. One of the foals followed halfway before stopping, unsure of the brightness, the open air. The other stayed inside, watching from the doorway. Caleb kept his gaze forward. The mare didn't come to his side. She stopped a few paces behind him. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward the eastern trail. Caleb closed his eyes for a brief second, as if that might undo it. "Don't start," he said under his breath. The mare didn't move closer, didn't push, didn't make a sound. She just stood there, facing that same direction, as if something out there mattered in a way this place never could. Caleb let out a dry laugh that held no humor. "You think I don't know where that goes?" he muttered. "You think I forgot?" The words felt heavier than they should have. He took a sip from the mug, though the coffee had gone lukewarm. His hand wasn't steady anymore. Not from the cold, from something else. Memory didn't come all at once. It never did. It crept in through the edges. Small things first. A voice telling him not to leave things undone. A hand resting on his arm the last time they stood together on this porch. A quiet request he had nodded to without really hearing. Don't close yourself off completely, Caleb. Don't lose him, too. He swallowed hard and stared harder at the trail, as if looking long enough might wear it away again. Behind him, one of the foals let out a soft, uncertain sound. The kind that didn't demand attention but made it impossible to ignore. Caleb turned this time. The smaller one had stepped onto the porch, its legs unsure on the boards, its body leaning slightly towards the mare. It glanced between Caleb and its mother, as if trying to understand why the air had shifted. The mare lowered her head just enough to brush the foal's neck, steady, patient, certain. Caleb felt something tighten deep in his chest. "They'll be fine here," he said, though the words sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than anything else. "Plenty of space, shelter, no reason to go wandering off." The mare lifted her head again, and for the first time since she arrived, Caleb thought he saw something in her gaze that unsettled him. Not defiance, not fear, but something far worse. Understanding. As if she already knew what he was refusing to admit. He looked away first. The mug in his hand had gone cold, and the line of that trail, dark, patient, waiting, seemed a little clearer than it had the day before. That afternoon, Caleb did something he had avoided for years. He went to the back wall of the cabin and pulled open the old wooden chest. The hinges resisted at first, swollen from winters and neglect, but then gave way with a dull crack. Inside lay what he had left untouched: papers, a few worn photographs, and beneath them, a bundle of envelopes tied with a thin strip of cloth that had once been part of his wife's dress. He stood there a long time before reaching in. The mare had followed him in without a sound. She didn't crowd him, didn't lower her head or shift her weight. She simply stood off to the side, as if she understood this was not something she could enter, only witness. Caleb untied the cloth. The top envelope was yellowed, its edges softened with time. He didn't need to read the name on the front. He knew the handwriting too well, his wife's, steady even when her strength had been fading. He slid the letter free and unfolded it. The paper crackled faintly. He didn't read it all. He didn't have to. He already knew the words. They had lived somewhere beneath his skin for years, even when he pretended they hadn't. Don't let pride be the last thing you hold on to. If the road clears, you go to him. You don't wait. Caleb let out a breath that seemed to empty more than his lungs. "I said I would," he murmured, voice low, rough with the weight of it. "I told her I would." But he hadn't. He had stayed. Stayed in the cabin, in the silence, in the comfort of knowing no one would ask anything from him if he never crossed that trail again. He folded the letter back slowly, his fingers less steady now, and set it aside. Beneath it lay another envelope, blank, untouched. He stared at it for a moment before reaching for the pen that sat near the stove. The chair scraped against the floor as he sat. For a long time, nothing happened. The foals shifted behind him, one nudging at the other, the soft sounds of their movement filling the cabin in a way that felt too alive for what he was about to do. The mare remained still, her presence pressing gently at the edges of the moment. Caleb lowered the pen to the paper. His hand hovered. Then, slowly, he began to write. The words didn't come easily. They came in fragments, in pauses, in lines he crossed out and rewrote. He didn't dress them up, didn't soften them. He wrote what he should have said years ago, before silence had done its work. He wrote about the day his son left, about the way he had stood on this very porch, saying nothing when everything that mattered should have been said, about how time had passed without fixing anything, about how he had mistaken distance for peace. The pen scratched against the paper, the sound sharp in the quiet. Outside, the light shifted as the sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the yard. The eastern trail was no longer hidden. It lay open now, a clear line cutting through thawed earth, leading away from everything Caleb had chosen to remain inside. He finished the letter just as the last of the light slipped from the window. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he folded it, slid it into the envelope, and pressed it shut with a firm, final motion. No hesitation this time. He stood, the letter in his hand, and turned toward the door. The mare moved then. Not forward, not blocking him. She stepped aside, clearing the path. Caleb paused, watching her. There was no urgency in her, no insistence. Just that same quiet certainty she had carried since the night she arrived. "You've been waiting for this," he said under his breath. The mare blinked once. He let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Guess I have too." He stepped outside into the fading light. The air had warmed just enough to soften the edges of the cold, but it still carried the bite of winter not quite finished. The ground beneath his boots was uneven, patches of ice giving way to mud. Each step toward the road felt heavier than it should have. The mailbox stood at the edge of the property, leaning slightly where the post had shifted over the years. Caleb stopped in front of it. For a moment he just stood there, the letter in his hand, feeling the weight of it, not in paper, but in everything it carried. Years. Regret. A chance that might already be too late. He opened the box, hesitated, then placed the letter inside. The metal door shut with a hollow sound that echoed more than it should have. Caleb stayed there a moment longer, staring at the closed box as if expecting something to change the instant he let go. Nothing did. The world remained exactly as it was. Behind him he heard the soft crunch of hooves. He didn't turn right away. When he did, the mare stood a short distance from the porch. The foals gathered close to her sides. They hadn't followed him all the way. They had simply watched. Waiting. Caleb walked back slowly. Each step toward the cabin felt different now. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer. He stopped a few feet from the mare. "You could stay," he said quietly. "No one's forcing you to go." The words sounded weaker than he intended. One of the foals shifted, stepping slightly forward, then hesitating. The mare lowered her head just enough to touch the foal's shoulder, not stopping it, not urging it, just reminding it where it belonged. Caleb felt the truth of that settle in his chest, heavy and undeniable. He looked past them toward the trail, then back at the cabin, then at the mare. "I can't keep you here," he said, the words barely more than breath. "Not if it means holding you back from where you're meant to be." The mare's ears flicked once. Caleb swallowed hard. The sky darkened another shade, the first hints of evening settling in. Tomorrow, he knew, the ground would soften more. The trail would be easier to cross. The choice he had delayed would no longer have anything left to hide behind. He turned toward the cabin, his steps slow, deliberate. Behind him, the mare did not follow right away. She remained where she was, facing the open land beyond the yard, as if she had already begun to leave. The sky broke open slowly that morning, pale light stretching across the thawing land, as if the night had taken something with it and left the rest behind. Caleb was already awake. He hadn't slept much. The chair by the stove still held the shape of where he had sat for hours, staring at the door, listening to the quiet breathing that had filled the cabin these past weeks. It was different now. Not empty, but waiting. He stood without rushing and pulled on his coat. The letter was gone from the table. The scarf remained, folded where he had left it, a small weight in a room that suddenly felt too large again. The mare was at the door before he reached it. She didn't push, didn't shift. She simply stood there, as she had on that first night. But nothing about this moment felt the same. The foals lingered behind her. One stepped forward, then back again, uncertain. The other pressed close, as if sensing something it couldn't yet understand. Caleb placed his hand on the latch. This time there was no hesitation. The door opened. Cold air moved in, softer now, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint promise of something new pushing through it. The snow had pulled back overnight, leaving the ground dark and open. The trail to the east lay clear, no longer hidden, no longer something he could pretend didn't exist. He stepped aside. The mare didn't move right away. For a brief moment, she turned her head toward the interior of the cabin, the stove, the worn table, the corner where the Foals had slept. Her gaze lingered just long enough to mark it, to acknowledge it, before returning to Caleb. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "Not for that night. Not for any of it." The words felt small compared to what had passed between them. The mare stepped forward. Her hooves crossed the threshold with the same care they had shown when she first entered, but the direction was reversed now. The foals followed, one quick and eager, the other hesitant, glancing back once before stepping into the light. Caleb watched them move across the yard. Each step took them further from the cabin, from the circle of warmth that had held them through the worst of winter. The ground was uneven, soft beneath their hooves, but the mare moved with certainty, guiding them toward the trail without looking back again. Caleb stayed where he was. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curling slightly as if they wanted to reach for something that was already gone. He didn't call out, didn't try to stop them. He had made his choice. And this was what it looked like. The smaller foal paused halfway to the trail. It turned, just for a second, its ears flicking back toward the cabin. Toward him. Caleb felt something twist deep in his chest, sharp and sudden. "Go on," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Stay with her." The foal hesitated, then turned back, trotting awkwardly to catch up. The mare never broke stride. They reached the edge of the trail and slowed, the three of them forming a quiet line against the open land. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the wind still, the sky pale and wide above them. Then the mare stopped. She turned her head, not fully, just enough. Her gaze found Caleb one last time. There was nothing in it that asked him to change his mind, nothing that pulled at him to follow. Only that same steady recognition, as if to say, "You did what you were meant to do." Caleb swallowed hard, his throat tightening against the weight of it. "Yeah," he whispered. "Took me long enough." The mare turned forward again, and this time she didn't stop. The three of them moved down the trail, their shapes growing smaller against the rising light, until the land swallowed them completely. No sound followed. No trace lingered beyond the marks their hooves left in the soft ground. Caleb stood there long after they were gone. The silence that settled in wasn't the same as before they had come. It didn't press in, didn't hollow things out. It stayed, different. He turned back toward the cabin slowly. Each step felt heavier than it should have, but there was something beneath it now, a steadiness he hadn't carried in years. The door stood open behind him, the inside visible in a way it hadn't been for a long time. He stepped up onto the porch, paused, then crossed the threshold. The warmth inside was faint, but it remained. The chair by the stove, the table, the scarf, and space. Not empty space. Room. A sound broke the quiet, not from the stove, not from the shifting wood, from outside. Caleb turned. A truck sat at the edge of the yard, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. He hadn't heard it arrive. The driver's door stood open. A man stepped out slowly, his movements uncertain, like someone not sure he had come to the right place. Caleb didn't move. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt longer than the trail the mare had taken. Then the man lifted a hand, holding something out. An envelope. Caleb recognized it immediately. The same paper. The same fold. Only now, it had been opened. "I got your letter," the man said, his voice carrying across the yard, rough in a way that felt familiar and foreign at the same time. Caleb's chest tightened. He took a step forward, not toward the road, toward the space between them. The cabin door remained open behind him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to close it. Sometimes love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go, even when it breaks you. Caleb didn't lose everything that morning. He finally chose what truly mattered. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting. Stories that remind us what it means to be human through the quiet, powerful bond between people and horses.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below and follow Horse Heart Healing for more stories like this.